Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming in. Welcome to mine and Mr. Robert Beck's session, Anti-Racist Labor in the Context of Racist Legislation. My name is Fred Miller. I'm a graduate student currently at the American College of Education. I'm talking about my presentation titled Resisting Censorship of Critical Race Theory, which came out of work I did under Dr. Patricia Webb during my MA at Arizona State. Many thanks to her, as well as Dr. Orr and Dr. Jensen at ASU, who were all super helpful in guiding my work. As a basic preface, since January of 2021, 15 states have taken some form of legally binding action to ban the teaching of critical race theory, or CRT, in education. These state laws each basically work to define CRT as a discriminatory and racist ideology. The texts claim that CRT leads to anti-white discrimination, attributing terms like divisive concepts, race scapegoating, and political indoctrination. Educators who incorporate principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their work might find themselves targeted by these laws, so educators are one key source of resistance to these laws' claims. Many educators would make the argument that CRT pedagogies are beneficial because they deconstruct white supremacist influences within and beyond education. My hope in this presentation is that we come to better understand why these laws are increasingly common and that we come up with ideas for what might be done in response. So I'd like to start by situating this presentation of the context of our location in space and time, the influence of this conference, and our sharing in this particular presentation series. First and foremost, I invite you all to take a moment to reflect on the traditional homelands upon which this city is built, the land of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, Kickapoo, and Illinois nations, all of whom represent a rich history which defines our immediate geography. I'd also like to regard those indigenous peoples who are not recorded by our historical record and those I've failed to regard personally. We will be talking today about a history of racist cultural logic that's embedded in our American laws and institutions. In that same vein, I think it's important that we consciously regard the national sin of forced removal as a legal reality that actively persists in the legacy and the daily life of the city of Chicago. Although I don't explicitly mention the historical impacts of American law on indigenous peoples, I encourage you to frame this presentation as deeply correlated with the subject. We're going to be talking about the basics of CRT, and an important conversation in the implementing of CRT is that the perspectives and stories of indigenous peoples are often omitted. I can certainly deepen my own commitment to broadening my understanding of CRT in the context of indigenous viewpoints. One intention of mine personally is to read Linda Tuawai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, which I had recommended to me recently as a good starting point for understanding this dynamic of understanding how indigenous perspectives are omitted when integrating CRT. Next, I'd like to frame the presentation in the context of our conference with the theme Doing Hope in Desperate Times. This paradigm that we're working with offers the optimistic perspective that educators are in a strong position to comprehend and productively address social justice issues. My hope is that by looking closely at the laws that oppose anti-racist education, we can start to craft some actionable initiatives for doing hope in the face of this censorship. I'd also like to make a quick note as to why I'm focusing only on anti-CRT laws rather than on general anti-CRT discourse. You might be aware that particular news outlets and politicians are very heavy drivers for growing public sentiment against CRT. While it would be valid to look at these voices as a point of critique, I have a couple reasons for only focusing on laws, specifically laws that have already been passed, implemented, are active, and working in education today. An important element of these texts is that they're actually empowered on the basis of American common law. That means these laws, they're actively situated in preceding laws that justify their existence, ultimately supported by standing precedents, established interpretations of the American Constitution. I think that what's helpful is Judith Butler's excitable speech, Politics of the Performative, sheds some light on why these words that exist in law are so powerful. Butler's work proceeds from Louis Althusser's notion that the subject is brought into existence by the act of interpolation, or bringing something into being by first giving it a linguistically intelligible signifier. In order for an utterance to have power or the ability to affect change, it needs to be used repeatedly. It creates a historical context that preserves the utterance as derivative of a powerful origin that it refers to. Consider a game of Scrabble. When somebody plays a word, they're asserting its validity as meaningful. That validity generally refers to the Scrabble dictionary, which is basically a standard collection of words that have the power to score points in the game. That Scrabble dictionary and the game itself, furthermore, would lose validity as a playable game if it didn't adhere to elements of standard English. And this referential deriving of power goes on and on and on. In our case, the validity and stability of the government's interpolation of particular concepts like CRT depends on reference to precedent. It provides context for the citational power that the American court system draws upon for its rulings, and the legislative system that it models for the creation of new laws. You can think of a particular vein of legal precedent as what Krista Ratcliffe would call a cultural logic. Cultural logic will be a common theme in this presentation, so I want to quickly describe it. Ratcliffe's rhetorical listening, among doing many other things, defines barriers to cross-cultural communication, or things that make it hard to identify with other individuals or groups. Ratcliffe offers that troubled identifications occur when discourse reveals conflict between different cultural logics. So Ratcliffe describes that, quote, if a claim is an assertion of a person's thinking, a cultural logic is a shared way of reasoning within which a claim may function. Think of a cultural logic, in our case, as a collective acceptance of firmly held precedents. Different cultural logics can naturally come to different conclusions about particular data, dialogues, words, or phrases. Some salient examples, of course, include race, racism, and critical race theory. So with that definition, let's get underway. Just like we took a look at the interpolative chain of Scrabble, let's take a look at the interpolative chain of American legal precedent as it defines race. We'll start from the beginning with the American Constitution. While not protecting the institution of slavery directly, the Constitution endorsed slavery in the Fugitive Slave Clause, mandating the return of slave labor to their quote-unquote rightful owner upon request. From 1776 to the institution of the 13th Amendment in 1885, white supremacy was explicitly endorsed in its most extreme form of slavery by the most fundamental document to the American government structure. Even following the 13th Amendment, white supremacy existed with provision in the forms of black codes, government-sponsored voter suppression, Jim Crow laws, and decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson. The precedent represents what Ratcliffe would call a cultural logic of white supremacy. When precedent endorses the logic of white supremacy, the law conceptualizes race as a biological reality, which denotes hierarchies between racial groups. Government-endorsed white supremacist logic obviously has acted as a legal justification for the subjugation of non-white Americans for a long part of our nation's history. However, when the right people agree that rules should be changed, much like in a game of Scrabble, the rules are changed. When a family or dorm room gets in an argument that one word should or should not be allowed, they make that decision and they change the rule. They don't need to contact the people who wrote the rules. They don't need to contact the people that made the dictionary. They change the rules because their context called for it. Judicial rulings similarly get overturned from time to time, sometimes to huge effect. A judge sees a context that they believe changes how a law should be interpreted, and that law or that interpretation of the law is changed. If the cultural logic that underlies an entire legacy of laws is replaced because of an overturned precedent, then the effects of those laws change accordingly. The introduction of colorblind or race-neutral logic was a massive development in American legal precedent, which characterized the success of the Civil Rights Movement. Examples include Brown v. Board of Education, the resulting Civil Rights Act of 1964, not resulting, but these are heralded as major successes in race activism because they negated the influence of explicit white supremacy on American legal precedent. Indeed, the landmark events should be celebrated for what they are, tremendous social progress, forcing the government to be liable to the fundamental logic that one race doesn't have inherent superiority. This can be called the cultural logic of colorblindness. And colorblind logic, though, has proven to have demonstrable conceptual problems, including the assumption that there's no validity to conversations concerning the nature and reality of race politics in the US, because colorblind legal logic isn't prepared to encounter race as an issue. This can allow persistent instances of white supremacy and structural racial imbalance in general to go unnoticed, untreated, and thus de facto protected under the current status of the law. Colorblindness is clearly characterized in this way by the standing precedent set by Justice Lewis F. Powell's 1978 decision on Bakke v. Regents of California, stating that the purpose of the Equal Protection Clause is to protect the rights of individuals regardless of race. This ruling overturned two previous interpretations that the Equal Protection Clause was instead intended to serve the needs of freed slaves or demonstrably underserved racial minorities. So this decision overturned the originally progressive initiative of colorblind logic on its head to censor white citizens' discontent with the public policies intended to serve racial minorities. This decision then represents the cultural logic of colorblindness that dictates how the government should treat race today. We can see this standing precedent as empowering to those laws that are currently working to ban critical race theory. So finally, let's take a closer look at how these laws enforce a colorblind logic. When colorblind laws take issue with the idea of CRT in education, my conclusion is that they fundamentally take issue with the idea that CRT endorses the study of race and racism, something colorblindness considers wholesale invalid. That's the basic idea of CRT. In Radcliffe's words, critical race studies, she calls it, commands that race be studied, not to reify its existence, but to expose its functions, so as to interrupt injustices and to promote social justice. The way that colorblind logic characterizes CRT, though, is that because CRT promotes discussions about race, it promotes quote-unquote divisive concepts in which they allegedly lead to the alienation of white students and faculty, is the general criticism. Furthermore, the implication of CRT pedagogy in structural is that structural racism exists in American government and institutions. That's considered through a colorblind lens to be un-American and divisive. For example, getting into some actual text, the Florida Board of Education mandates that instruction may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely in universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. In other words, any reflection on American history needs to be blind to the very real connection between the founding of the United States and the institution of slavery. Similarly, North Dakota prohibits interrogating the connection between systemic racism and the American legal system at all. Let's look closely at that text. A school may not include instruction related to critical race theory, which they define as the theory that racism is not merely a product of individual bias or prejudice, but that racism is systemically embedded in American society and the American legal system to facilitate racial inequality. I would say that that is what we call saying the quiet part out loud. For emphasis, the text explicitly states that racism can only be described as explicitly individual. In other words, bad apples, actual racists. There is no opportunity for inquiry that it might be a little possible for some elements of American society and government to promote even a bit of racism. In each of these examples, CRT is accused of being anti-American because CRT defines American principles as situated in the historical context of white supremacy. To colorblindness, that's problematic. Please let me know afterward if you want to learn more about specific active legal texts that come from each of these 15 states. I have a file I can share with each of the 15 states' texts, as well as a little more detailed analysis that I got into when I wrote the big old paper beforehand. As a general idea, it seems that colorblind precedent is specifically reactive to CRT in education because they disagree with one another on a fundamental, logical basis. On one side, the study of racism should be avoided completely, while on the other side, racism is seen as a necessary point of inquiry for the sake of social justice. It makes sense that colorblindness replaced the legal precedent backed by white supremacy, but now it seems that there's an opportunity to make progress past the limiting viewpoints of colorblindness. As educators are being targeted by colorblind laws, we become sites of resistance. We can be the context or a context which incites a change in the logics that underlie our legal system. So as a critical response to colorblind anti-CRT laws, I'd like to conceptualize some opportunities for how we as educators might be able to assert CRTs in ways that make apparent the limitations of colorblind precedents. My hope is that the assertion of a fundamental logic of critical race studies both in practice and in public advocacy, can stimulate change and hopefully press our judicial system to consider turning precedent to honor a more race-conscious cultural logic. I am by no means an expert. I don't have experience teaching personally, and my suggestions here won't be comprehensive. Like many things in teaching social justice, these things are recursive. They should not be held to perfectionism, and they should be held to constant recursive critique. So I invite you to please chime in if something sounds funky. And I lost my place. So yeah, I do hope these ideas can be a starting point as we can begin to formulate resistance to the censorship laws. In order for educators to promote a race-conscious cultural logic, I think that we would benefit from drawing upon some basic tenets of critical race theory. This is just one conversation, we're just one room of people, but I think that having more discussions that elucidate the logically situated fundamentals of CRT can help educators align on how we collectively encourage our legal systems and the public to eventually trust and endorse a national race-conscious curriculum. So with that being said, here are some fundamentals of CRT as they apply to colorblind resistant education practices. The first one is that okay, I can just talk about it. So the first one is that this idea that racism is normal. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look for this. So, okay, we're just gonna go. So this idea that, as Toni Morrison says, race is always present in every social configuring of our lives. And where colorblindness would say that racism exists, it arises out of individuals, out of explicit, racist behavior. Again, the quote-unquote bad apples, the quote-unquote real racists. An important thing as a point of resistance to that idea is it was Dr. Dakota Irby yesterday in the keynote conference yesterday. He made a great point of offering proximal and devastating evidence. He was talking about this in pedagogies. This idea that, we need to situate racism as something that's happening in this classroom, in this community, not down the hall, across the river, or across state borders, but something that's going on here and now, and something we need to elucidate and see. And we need to not only use that in pedagogy, but use it in activism to show school administrators, peers, lawmakers, parents in some cases, that the issue of racism is not something that's abstract and uncommon. It is something that's mundane and normal and devastating on an individual level. So additionally, we want to demonstrate how race neutrality threatens the quality of educators' work. This idea that racism is normal also contributes to the idea that the ignorance of racism can be heavily detrimental to the process of educating students. And being able to demonstrate that and being able to use that as a point of public activism seems to be one productive site for popularizing this narrative of the importance of critical race studies and the dangers of race-neutral laws. Another idea is finding identification in anti-essentialism. So a huge critique of colorblindness, or a huge critique from colorblindness on critical race theory is the idea that critical race theory is painted as essentialist thinking. Teachers like to think of, people like to bring up these anecdotes that they hear in the news or whatever, of this story of a teacher that split the classroom in half between white and non-white students and made the white students apologize for being racist, and et cetera, et cetera. These stories go on and on. And it basically just paints critical race theory as essentialist thinking. You are this way because you are this race. That is actually a key misconception that comes out of colorblind thinking, because critical race theory, one of its core tenets lies in anti-essentialism. But it's not the same anti-essentialism of race doesn't exist, so I can be whoever I want to be. Rather, it's similar, but it's different. It's intersectional anti-essentialism. It's because I have so many, or one has so many multiple and conflicting identities that essentialism based on a single identity is invalid. I think that this is a potential point of identification, a starting point for having conversations with colorblind thinkers in this idea of clarifying that this is not essentialist thinking. We can proceed from a place of anti-essentialism together. And I might be wrong about this, but I personally, and I don't have any experience with this, but this is definitely a point of inquiry, something perhaps to explore. Let me see if I can find my place again. Hey, thank you.
Yeah, just keep going. Just keep going.
Much appreciated. Another really good point is counter-narrative. An important facet of CRT is the idea that narrative and marginalized experiences can often be more illustrative, informative, enriching than the homogeneous, quote-unquote neutral, quote-unquote objective, and historically white perspectives that persist in our education system today. So counter-narrative can take place in pedagogy and how you facilitate curricula, and it can be hugely useful. I also recommend educators using this as a point of public advocacy as well, of showing, why are these neutral, objective, white dominant perspectives limiting, demonstrating and showing to the public why are these things false. We think about the 1619 Project as a huge point of criticism against critical race theory. A lot of people use it as source material for a way to criticize critical race theory. And again, it might be one of those cases in which people are just not looking deeply into what exactly it is doing. And an important point is to continue that work, continue that labor of saying, this is why other narratives are valuable. Not just saying other narratives are valuable, but really doing the work to try to communicate that. And again, going back to counter-narrative and pedagogy, when you have success with counter-narrative and pedagogy, share that with your peers. Share that with media, school newspapers, local newspapers, things like that, to show that there's a richness of learning experiences that comes out of the use of counter-narratives. And then the last one is this idea of interest convergence, which is a core, fundamental facet of the implications of critical race theory. Derek Bell's theory out of 1980, the idea that racial equality has only seen progress when black interests have converged with the interests of white elites. And hopefully, the idea is that we can work to help create perspectives of shifting towards a race-centering logic of academia through simply kind of moral conversion. But another thing to aim for and look for is where can we find those places that the white elite people that are making these, the lawmakers and whatnot that are making these laws, how can we get them to see that there are limits to colorblindness in a way that is beneficial to their own growth? Are there ways that we can show that it would be beneficial to them to endorse some tenets of critical race theory? Is it possible? Are there outlooks for that? I don't know, but definitely something to look for, one point of potential growth and development in the future. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the risks of promoting critical race theory. If you're an educator in one of these 15 states, if you're an educator in a state where these things are going to be implemented in the future, because they're not necessarily slowing down, how do you mitigate that risk? How do you work through that risk? When it's threatening your livelihood, your ability to work and make money and to influence people's lives and promote this social activism through pedagogy. One suggestion is that if you have no other choices, that resistance should be subversive. This is another suggestion from Dr. Irby that I stole, because he's a very smart guy. But be subversive and look for places where you can fill the spaces that you're allowed to fill, to work within the guidelines. The way that I like to think about it is like an artist that only paints with 2 colors, or playing a game of Scrabble with only adjectives. Things that force you to be creative to deliver the same curriculum within the boundaries that are being placed on you. So optimistically, it's an opportunity for creativity when subversion is the only option that you have. And again, it's important to share your successes, share what works, because this is a recursive practice against the narrative of perfectionism, this idea that people need to come together, coalesce, work in interdisciplinarity to figure out what methods work and how to work around these things that can eventually, multiply our chances of promoting critical race theory in a productive way. And other critical